Larloch was one of the most powerful archwizards of Netheril who survived the fall that destroyed every other floating city, dragging himself to the shattered ruins of an enclave called Orbadal in the Troll Hills on the Sword Coast, where he claimed the wreckage as his own, and then spent the next 2,000 years collecting spells that still worked alongside others the surface world had forgotten entirely, while he pulled artifacts from rubble most wizards believed had been lost in the catastrophe. He found scattered pages of the Nether Scrolls, the ancient texts that first taught humanity how to shape magic, and he studied them until they yielded something no other wizard possessed: knowledge that allowed raw material to become artifacts of divine power inside a hidden workshop beneath a quiet hill, while the rest of the world assumed such objects could only be discovered. Over 2,000 years, Larloch gathered more than spells, binding 60 liches under telepathic command, each one a wizard who had already survived death through magic, and now stood chained to a single mind in a network that shared sight and sound across every body, so that when one guardian sensed movement in the lowest corridor of the Warlock's crypt, the entire system reacted before an intruder reached the second door. 16 red wizards of Thay marched into the Troll Hills hoping to claim that vault, bringing enough combined power to level a city without understanding that challenging Larloch meant facing every mind in the network at once, their spells reflecting back against failing wards, while 2,000 years of layered magic tore their bodies apart in corridors where enchantments soaked into stone, the same way Hallister spread his quasi-mythal through Undermountain, except that Larloch's defences represented the work of an entire dead civilization compressed into a single fortress. Szass survived only because he arrived late, walking through corridors filled with the remains of 16 colleagues before calling them fools, and negotiating instead of fighting, leaving with artifacts that Larloch handed out casually because his vault held more power than any single wizard could ever spend. Larloch gathered everything that already existed, 2,000 years of patience filling a vault with the memory of a vanished empire. Yet the wizard ranked just below him created something that had never existed before, the device that made Netheril worth remembering at all. A wizard named Ioulaum lived in the earliest centuries of that empire when permanent enchantments drained years from the caster's life and every magical object demanded a sacrifice measured in vitality. Yet he refused to accept that cost and spent decades studying the invisible current of magic flowing through the world until he learned how to capture it. His answer became the Mythallar, a crystal sphere 150 feet across that drew raw magic from the weave and poured it outward for a mile in every direction, so that enchantments inside its reach required no life at all, turning magic from a resource that consumed the wizard into something as common as air, and transforming Netheril from a land of scholars into a civilization that could lift cities into the sky. Ioulaum eventually cast a spell so powerful that modern magic no longer remembers its name, an 11th level invocation that tore the peak from a mountain and flipped the stone upside down before he fixed a Mythallar beneath the floating mass and forced raw magic through the crystal until the entire structure rose into the air, creating the first floating enclave in the history of the Forgotten Realms, a city called Xinlenal, hanging above the earth as proof that one wizard had decided limits were optional. Other arcanists followed that example, carving mountains into foundations for their own Mythallars and lifting city after city into the sky, above what is now the desert of Anauroch, until Netheril existed entirely above the ground, while its citizens looked down on the surface, the way sailors look down at the ocean floor, something distant that no longer mattered. Ioulaum trained thousands of arcanists across 5 centuries and watched the empire spread across the horizon before vanishing into the Underdark when the magic sustaining those cities began to fail, leaving panic behind that pushed a younger wizard named Karsus toward an experiment no mortal had ever attempted. Karsus watched an empire slowly falling from the sky as Mythallars flickered and creatures called Phaerimm burrowed beneath the land, draining magic the way parasites drain blood. Every floating city losing altitude month by month, while the civilization Ioulaum created struggled to stay alive until Karsus decided that saving Netheril required stealing power from the goddess who maintained magic itself. He built the only 12th level spell ever cast, a ritual so complex that one component required the stone-filled gizzard of a gold dragon soaked in Tarask blood, and he spent 6 hours completing it while the cities of Netheril sank lower around him. The spell struck Mystryl, goddess of magic, ripping divine power out of the heavens and forcing it into a mortal mind until Karsus stood on his floating city holding the knowledge of a god for one terrible moment, long enough to realize that Mystryl alone kept the weave intact and that stealing her power had just broken the system that allowed every spell in the world to function. Mystryl sacrificed herself to stop the collapse, severing the connection before the unraveling spread any further, an act that killed her instantly and stripped Karsus of stolen divinity at the same moment, leaving his body frozen as stone on the deck of his own enclave, while every Mythallar in Netheril failed together. Cities that had floated for 3,000 years fell out of the sky in a single afternoon, smashing into the land below with enough force to change the shape of a continent, while the goddess returned as Mystryl, carrying the memory of that catastrophe, placing a permanent limit on magic so that no spell above the 9th level could ever function again, and no mortal would ever reach the power Karsus held for less than a minute. 7 wizards challenged that ceiling across the long history of the Forgotten Realms, their stories stretching from a frozen city on the Moonsea, where one wizard fought his own copies, to the afternoon when an entire empire fell from the sky. Each challenge proving that magic never truly stops pushing against the limits placed upon it. The most famous wizard alive has never broken those limits, yet his life shows how close a mortal can stand to the boundary. Elminster Omar has lived more than 1,200 years in a quiet farmhouse in Shadowdale, where he solves problems that gods and archdevils send to his door while carrying power capable of leveling cities. None of it earned through study, and all of it granted by the goddess of magic who chose him as her living conduit, pouring Silverfire into a man who never needed to invent spells that conquered death or lifted mountains because divinity itself chose him. On a foggy morning in Shadowdale, he walks the same road he has followed for centuries, passing fields untouched by the disasters that destroyed Netheril, while the world around him still lives beneath the ceiling Karsus built.